All right, well, it's 12:30 and we will begin our session on critical thinking. And that has a lot of different meanings. I think what people think about thinking sometimes is different from what the person sitting next to you thinks about thinking. So I will ask you to be thinking about that today, not to be redundant, um, and to and to be open to the possibility that the way we think isn't just something that happens. It's actually a process that we can influence and control on an intentional and deliberate basis. So I'm going to ask you this question. In just a moment, I'm going to ask you to tell me how would you estimate your thinking habits? What would you say they are? How effective are they working for you? So just to have that in the back of your mind. And we're actually going to talk about that because it turns out there really is a back of your mind. All of these things are aspects of our thinking process. So in just a moment, I'll ask you about the thinking process and how it works for you. Okay. So first we'll take a look at the PowerPoint for a moment here. And the idea is effective, clear, and critical thinking. And what's the benefit to this, right? If we could think more clearly, if we could think more effectively, if we could think more critically, where's the good side of this? What difference does it make if our thinking isn't everything that we would like it to be? But the reality is that particularly in business, it translates into dollars, it translates into human cost, it translates into monetary cost, translates into all of these things, because in some fashion, when we make our decisions, when we're making our choices, when we're not seeing something clearly, not thinking clearly about it, we're going to make less effective choices. And these will affect us in the long term in terms of the profitability of our enterprise, in terms of how we interact with other people, in terms of how our business performs. I mean, every aspect about this is kind of part of that. There isn't anything that our thinking doesn't affect, really, when you get right down to it. So let's take a look at what we've got here. Please let me introduce myself. My name is Joseph Lyman. I'm one of the trainers with Mindset Go, and I'm super excited to be here with you. I've been doing this now for about 15 years. I've been teaching something for about 30. And this is, nearly 2,000 seminars later, here we are. I've covered 4 continents, 25 countries, and 45 states. So it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. Thank you very much. Okay, enough about me. The rest of the day is about you. And one of the things that we won't get too deeply into today, but just to have in the back of your mind, again, there's that place in terms of awareness, is the idea that IQ is not the only form of intelligence that we possess, right? And we can actually have a much greater influence on our IQ than was previously believed. But we're talking about multi-generational IQs. There are as many as 5 generations in the workplace right now, and we don't all think alike, which is pretty evident to anybody who's spent more than 5 minutes in the workplace. And it's about what is our intelligence as we approach a conversation? What is our emotional intelligence? And all of these together make up the aspects of how we interact in the workplace, how we come across, how we are successful. And I mean, I think that's the key, right? Our ability to communicate well and clearly and to think well and clearly affects the success of any and all of our endeavors. So just to be aware of that. And in terms of expectations, so the expectations that we believe that you come to here, what is something to be thoughtful about? What is something that will help us solve problems, right? Learning 3 new things, taking advantage of the opportunity to not only see things differently and think about them differently, literally in this case, we're going to talk about how we think about things, but to become more aware and to focus on having that growth mindset and the idea of recognizing that as human beings, we literally never stop changing, right? A very wise teacher of mine once said that it's not only that we recognize that change is constant, but that we're part of the change, that we are the change that's constantly happening. I mean, physically, our bodies are constantly changing. I understand roughly every 7 years, most of the cells in our body have been replaced. So when we think about things, when we develop awareness, when we're growing, we still have opportunities. As long as we're alive, we have an opportunity to learn and to move forward. So these are the great things. From my perspective, I thank you for being here, right? Your presence is appreciated. I will ask you to be present, not just mentally, but physically as well. Clearly, in this sense, I'm sorry, not just physically, but mentally as well. Clearly, you're here physically, mentally to be part of it, but I'll also ask you to be here emotionally. And what does that mean to be present emotionally? Just to be open to new ideas, to be open to the conversation, to be willing to contribute, right? I will ask sometimes I'll have questions for you, and I will ask you to put them into the chat box. And if you have any particular questions, please feel free to. If you want to contribute audibly, please just type the word talk in the chat box. I will call on you and you can unmute yourself, whatever you need to do. Totally fine. That way we can keep it in order and some semblance of rational basis as we move forward. I know this is sometimes virtual instructor-led learning is a little bit different from simply being in a classroom. So we will take advantage of all the good things that this opportunity provides. Right, our agenda. What are we going to do today? So for the next 45 minutes to an hour, we're going to talk about what are you currently doing right now in terms of how you think? What are you doing in terms of how you examine both the thing itself and how you think about the thing, right? And we'll talk about what could go wrong with that. Is there something in my current thinking process that might lead me to outcomes that are not exactly what I would want them to be? So we'll talk about thinking about thinking. And sometimes people say like, well, you know, I'm good to go. I think about things clearly really well. But we've never actually had an opportunity, for most of us, some of us it's a little different, but my belief is for the vast majority of us, in my experience, have never talked about formal methodology as it relates to thinking. Whether we're talking about business or personal, regardless of what we're talking about, we haven't had the opportunity to think about thinking, to talk about it in a very specific, deliberate, intentional way. And so I think this is a great opportunity to do that. And we'll look at some potential new thinking styles, new thinking tools that I will share with you today, and we'll go from there. So to begin, let's look at this. Let's look at a couple of aspects about our training today. What's the elephant in the room? And I think in this case, it's the idea of how can I think better about the things that confront me in the workplace? How can I address them more clearly? How can I more rationally be more perceptive, be more aware, be more clear in how I organize the things, the tools, the mental tools that I have to get better results, right? I mean, I think that's the end result for any training, but particularly for this one, because this one literally interacts with every single thing that you do. Whether you're reading an article to learn something more about a topic for discussion, or whether you're sitting there talking to someone, or whether you're just literally sitting and thinking, which I'm going to encourage you to do at some point here today, in terms of building this into your process, it's kind of a meta approach to this. How do I think about the things that I think about, and is it really serving me as well as I want it to? So we'll just be aware of that. And keep in mind that today's tools, we're talking about fundamentals, right? We're talking about how do I approach this? What are some ways to see it? I mean, there's certainly more that we could get into on a broader basis, on an individual basis, but today we're going to focus on what are the fundamentals? What am I doing? Is it working for me? Are there things that I can do that will make it better? And it's really just as simple as that. So the reason we look at it from this perspective is because there are not many things I'm completely certain of, but there are a few, and this is one of them. If we always do what we always did, we will always get what we always got, right? If we always do what we always did, we will always get what we always got. And in the end, much of our day, and certainly thinking is no exception to this rule. In fact, it might be one of the strongest indicators of it, is based on habit, is based on a routine of what we've always been doing. And so if we're going to change the outcome, if we're going to create a different and better outcome in terms of our thinking process, we have to do something differently, right? It's the only thing that makes it possible. Annie McKee, the leadership author, said that professional development without personal change was impossible. She didn't say it was hard, she said it was impossible. So if we're going to replace an old habit, the one thing that we have to have in its stead is a new one. It's nearly impossible for human beings to just say to themselves at some point, I'm going to do something differently. It's a great plan, but it doesn't actually work that way. It's kind of like saying, I'm going to win the lottery. It's a good idea and it's a lovely wish, but it's unlikely that simply saying that will make it happen. But if we take an old habit and we replace it with a new one, and then we begin to build on and reinforce that, then we can change outcomes and create something that is different and better in terms of what we're looking for. So we'll push on from there and look at it from that perspective. In the end, what we're talking about here is mindfulness. And one of my colleagues' daughters drew this picture, and I thought it was absolutely a perfect visual representation of what we're talking about. When we say mindful, do we mean our mind is full with all the untold number of things that are constantly floating through our head, and all of the emotional constructs and the physical and the mental and all of the things that are going on? Or do we mean we're being mindful of both ourselves, our environment, and the people that we work with and the situations that we find ourselves? Because in the end, if we can work with less stress, if we can develop better skills, whether they're coping skills in terms of emotional constructs or thinking skills in terms of how we see things, if we can have a clear self-image, and if we can deal with our emotions in a very clear and very effective way, we find ourselves less mindful and more mindful of our circumstances and our situation. And it just makes them easier, but it doesn't just do that. And that's the key. It makes them better, right? That's the key. It's easier and it's better. So it's a double win on some fundamental level. Good deal. All right. So first, let's take a look at this. I'm going to give you this, and I'm going to ask you to write in the chat box. These are phrases that you have likely heard before, but they're in a different form. So for instance, I'll give you the first one as a demonstration. People of above average intelligence usually reason along similar lines. Now, you may have heard that as great minds think alike. So it's a common phrase, but it's in an uncommon form. And sometimes when we're looking at something, looking at it differently, thinking about it differently, can create a different awareness of it. So let's take a look at these, and you can work on any of them and put them in the chat box. In a moment, when I close the PowerPoint for a moment, we'll go back to it and see what you say. So we'll just take any one of them or all of them if you like. 60 susceptible individuals will be born in any given hour. It often happens that says clowns. It looks like the word downs because of the text, but it's actually clowns say goodbye to their fortune. It's best to wait for poultry to mature before taking stock of them. And when an equine present is bestowed upon you, it's best not to inspect its oral cavity. Feel free with any of those. What do they sound like to you? Right? 60 susceptible individuals will be born in any given hour. What do you like about that? And I see there's some answers there. All right, I'm gonna. Okay, so let's go take a look and see what we've got. All right, a sucker is born every minute. Absolutely. Don't count your chickens before they're hatched. Someone is born every minute, which is absolutely true, but not exactly what we were looking for here. But thank you, Greg. Don't count your chickens before they're hatched. Don't look a gift horse in the mouth. Very good. Thank you, guys, from Ryan, from Kyle, from Vincent, all of them. These are excellent, right? Don't look a gift horse in the mouth. And let me go back there for just a moment. Let's see, we had a question here. A fool is born every hour. Actually, it's Anthony, it's one is born every minute, 60 in an hour. So yeah, there's one born. I believe P.T. Barnum's expression was there's one born every minute. And so we have that, right? Don't look a gift horse in the mouth. Sheila, thank you as well. Don't fix something that isn't broken. Good. Not on this particular one, but actually excellent. Let's go back and look at that again and see what we've got. Okay, so it often happens that clowns say goodbye to their fortune. Maybe you've heard it as a fool and his money are soon parted. Equine present, don't look a gift horse in the mouth. There's one born every minute, and wait for your chickens to hatch. Well done. Now, when we see these, when we see something different, it's about changing our perspective to see what we know in a new way. So I'm going to give you a couple of challenges as we go through the day today. And one of the challenges that I have for you is to create a couple of these on your own, to take a common sentence, I should say a common phrase, and to turn it into something less familiar, right? So clowns lose their money, is a fool and his money is soon parted, right? This sort of thing. So, and the purpose behind this exercise is to see the common in an uncommon way. And maybe you've heard about that in terms of the way people experience things, but to see the common in an uncommon way is actually a really big deal. It's about developing the desire, and I use this word very much on purpose, the desire. You'll hear me talk about this. When you want to make a change in one of your existing habits, one of the things that we need to do is it has to be on purpose, right? We said that, you know, if we have this habit and we want to put in a new habit and we want to change the habit, we have to come up with a new habit. But the other thing that's required is it has to be done on purpose. And so I'm going to encourage you to do these things as we go through the day. You should calculate more times than you execute. Excellent, from Vincent. Good. And just try to see things differently and recognize that when you see them differently, you're not only changing your perspective, but you're changing your understanding. And you're doing it, as I say, intentionally on purpose. And this becomes something that you can build as one of your habits, to see the common in an uncommon way. And this will make, this will become simpler, if you will, as we go through it. And we'll look at some of the tools that we can actually utilize to achieve that goal. Okay, so back to our PowerPoint for a moment. When we see this is the common in an uncommon way, but we have our current thinking habits. And my question is, what are yours? What are the things that you do as a thinker, right? So here's my question. And I said I would ask you this. What are your thinking skills? What happens in your head when you are confronted with a problem and you need to think about the solution to it? What happens in your world when that comes up? How does that work for you? What goes on in your mind? I'll give you guys a couple minutes to put this down in the chat box here, in the webinar chat. And it's, I get that it's a, okay, from Vincent, why are we doing this? How are we doing this? Greg says, what's the worst case? What's the best case scenario? Okay. And please, by the way, if somebody makes a comment, even if you have a similar one, I encourage you to enter it into the chat box, because everybody says things, sees things and says things a little bit differently. Brainstorming different solutions. All right, we're going to talk about that, because that's a very common methodology, is the idea of brainstorming, getting everybody together and talking about it. Absolutely. What else? What are you doing? When you say you're going to confront this problem and solve something that's going on, whether it's in the workplace or personal, it doesn't actually even matter, but particularly about the workplace, how are you coming at it? Now this is from Art, and I think this is a something that's different. There's a difference in terms of quantitatively here. What is the other person's goal? What does the customer want or need? And Ted, this ties directly back to what Art said. What is the other person's goal? What is the outcome needed? Ryan, how do we get to that outcome? Assess the situation. Try to see the big picture of it. From Sheila, from Anthony, seeing both sides of the situation. Now I think we're really getting into the heart of the matter here, because as we're discussing this, I mean, the idea here is, why are we doing this? How are we doing this? What's the best case? What's the worst case? These are all important, but they are not in and of themselves sufficient. The reality is that brainstorming, and this is part of it, what's the other person's goal? And we agree on a best solution. In a business sense, what does the customer want or need, right? Evaluate the problem. We're going to talk about that. Look for the easiest solution. Now, this is great. Kyle, I really like this. Look for the easiest solution and then ask yourself if it's the right solution. This is huge. This is actually, I will encourage every one of you to model this kind of thinking as we move forward in this, right? So what's the simplest solution? And how to say, I'm going to use a word very specifically here that I think is underutilized and misunderstood. And that word is elegant. And I want to encourage you to think in terms of, is there an elegant solution? And the word elegant sometimes sounds like it's unnecessarily prettified, or it's, you know, high end of some sort. But elegant is actually similar in its purpose to simple. And the simplification of any process is nearly always, Ted said, I think, streamlined. Exactly. How can we get something simple and effective? And I'll give you an example of a workplace situation that developed. There was a manufacturing facility, and they worked piecework. So of course, everybody got paid for the amount of work that they did, but not everybody works at the same rate of speed. And what they discovered was that it was really difficult to make sure that everybody had enough of the parts that they were assembling to be able to keep moving at their own rate of speed. And they couldn't figure out a good way to solve this problem. And they thought about a conveyor belt, which would allow people to just take what they need as they needed it. But now you're talking about machinery. Now you're talking about something that's expensive. Now you're talking about a solution that has complexity and is complicated. And yet at the same time, it seemed the most efficient one. And so instead of just jumping off at that point and saying, well, this will solve the problem, and there's no question that using the conveyor belt was going to solve the problem. The question was it the best solution to the problem? And it turned out it was very clearly not the best solution to the problem. Again, it was going to be very expensive. It was going to be very, very complicated. And then somebody said, what about colors? And they realized that what they could do is they could put 3 different color baskets with the parts next to each person who was using them. And they could color code the baskets. The first basket would be green. The second basket would be yellow, and the third basket would be red. And then they could use fillers to come and just keep track of the baskets. And all you had to do was look from a distance to see what color the basket was. If somebody was in the green basket, they were still working on their first basket, they were good to go. If somebody was working on the yellow basket, you could replace one and still make sure they had a good supply. And if somebody was working on the red basket, that meant that you had to jump and make sure that they got their supplies before they ran out of the basket they were working on. And this elegant, streamlined solution saved this company tens of thousands of dollars and allowed a simpler solution to deal with the problem. It just eliminated the need for mechanical devices, which of course, then you need maintenance, then you need to keep them running, then you need to do this. So each level of complexity that we add requires greater complexity in terms of how we evaluate the situation. So trying to find the simple, elegant, streamlined solution is really the direction that we always want to go in. So I think you guys are all on a good path here, right? Assess the situation, try to see the big picture. Here's my question. How do we do all of these things all the time, right? Because is there really a time, let's just take a quick look at these here, right? Is there really a time when you don't want to brainstorm different solutions? Now, there may be a necessity that you don't have time to do that, but ideally, if time allows, that's one of the things you want to do. What's the other person's goal? That's one of the things you want to do. What does the customer want? That's one. I mean, every one of these, evaluate the problem. What is the outcome that we need? These are all really important elements, and the problem is we don't always do all of them. And I think one of the reasons that we don't do that is because of our existing thinking habits. A couple of the things that we tend towards is we know there's a problem, so we immediately try to design a solution for it. Here's the problem with that approach. Maybe we don't understand the problem clearly in order to do that. And all too often, we jump into something before we actually understand it. Something's wrong, do something, did it work? Right? And we create this pattern of it didn't work, so maybe we should try something else. Okay, but now we have something. Ted just said this is why his wife yells at him a lot. This is absolutely true. Something's wrong, we do it, it didn't fix the problem, so we do something else. I still have the problem, do something different. Nope, that didn't fix it, do something different. Except the problem is we're focusing on solutions. We should be focusing on an understanding of the problem. Because if we don't know, if we can't be reasonably certain that the solution will make the problem go away, we probably haven't studied the problem enough. It's not about this isn't a good solution. It may or may not be. But the fact that we have that much uncertainty about it is actually part of the problem. So let's take a look at some of our, okay, well, we've got some questions here. Let's look that people mentioned. Evaluate the situation. Absolutely. This is a huge deal. Predict the possible outcomes. Melissa, I'm going to say you are spot on with this one. Predict the possible outcomes that could happen. We're going to look at this as part of our thinking process, as part of a couple of the tools that I'm going to give you today. And I think you'll find that this is, how to say, this can be a critical necessity that isn't necessarily always done. And that's part of the problem. There are critical aspects to our thinking process, but because of our emotional situation, because of our time situation, because of 100 other reasons, we don't do the things we need to do. And here's the problem. You came up with a solution, you implemented it, but it didn't fix the problem. And now you need another solution. Here's where this went wrong. By not taking the time to clearly understand the problem, and now we end up with multiple potential solutions that we didn't contemplate the outcomes for in any real clear, deliberate, purposeful sense, we've done ourselves a disservice, because now we're going to use more time, more energy, and more money in order to try and solve the problem that we wish we'd solved the first time. But as somebody once said about wishes, if wishes were horses, beggars would ride. And wishing isn't enough. It has to be deliberate and purposeful on our part, the way we look at things. So let's go back to the PowerPoint for a moment. So we're seeing how people are thinking about things at any given point in time. And we want to be able to do it, I'm going to use the deliberate word here, systematically. We want a thinking system that helps us get better at things. And here's the good news and the bad news. The good news is there's actually a reasonable possibility that we already know one. And let's take a look. Let's see what we've got here. Here's one called the ladder of inference. And if any of you have worked with systems thinking, you may have come across this. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to propose this to you as a potentially very useful system of thinking, a ladder of inference. And here's how it begins. Let's start at the bottom and climb our way to the top. We're going to begin with real data and experience, right? We're going to start by collecting information. Let's make an assumption actually at this point before we begin this. Let's assume, and this is by no means a given, but for the moment, for the sake of our conversation, we'll assume that we clearly understand the nature of the problem. I'm going to come back to this again because the vast majority of the time it's not true that we understand the nature of the problem, and that's one of the big things that causes us grief. But we begin by collecting real data and experience. What is going on? What is a clear understanding of the situation? And then we find the selected data and experience that is relevant and most important to what we need to work with here. So we collect the information and then we start to focus on it and see exactly what it is that we need that we're working with here. And then once we've done that, we can put meaning to it. We can say, this is what this indicates, this is what this indicates. And when we have that basis, now we can create our assumptions. And our assumptions will lead us to conclusions. And our conclusions will lead us to beliefs. And our beliefs will lead us to action. And if we want to look at this from a different perspective, although these are each steps on the ladder, as we say, implicit in its very name, here's a great graphic, right? We begin with data, then we select that we need what we need, find the meaning to it, create assumptions, conclusions, beliefs, which furnish us with actions, and then we repeat the process as necessary till we achieve the outcome that we're looking for. Now, two questions. One, do you think this seems like to you, do you think this looks to you to be a useful methodology in terms of how to solve our problems? Let me ask you that first. Just basically a yes or no sort of thing. What is it you think? Does it look reasonable? I mean, it kind of resembles the scientific process a little bit, but does it look reasonable to you that you could utilize this, right? Collect the data, figure out what data is important, what does it mean, and so forth, and move this. A basic yes, no, maybe. Do you think this looks useful? Brian says it does. Okay. Others, what do you think? Does that seem like a workable process to you? Art thinks so as well. Okay, good to go. Thank you, Ryan. Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I think we can be in general agreement. Yeah, Ivy, thank you. That this is something beneficial, that this is a process that we could utilize. And I will tell you that most people do exactly this, but a little different. Does anybody want to take a shot at what goes wrong when most people follow this process? They follow it, but they don't follow it correctly. In fact, the problem is they don't start from the beginning. I'm going to bring it back up and tell me if you think what might go wrong when people utilize this process. Not enough data taken. Okay. Start at conclusions. Greg. Okay. Yeah. Are the assumptions valid all the way through? Yep. 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 You're completely on the right track. Focus on their own data. Thank you, Art. Yeah. So here is what we do. Don't take the correct data and experience or they misunderstand. You're all very much on the right path here. And this is what we mostly do. We start with what we believe, and then we go find data and experience that back it up. Now, if you unfortunately want a picture-perfect display of how this works, look at nearly any politically related Facebook post in the last 2 years. We start with what we believe, and then we go look for data that reinforces our beliefs. right? As Ivy says, it's based on what you understand. Because, well, let me ask you this question. Why is it so difficult for us to start with real data and experience? Why is this such a dilemma for so many human beings in the workplace on a daily basis, also in their own personal worlds, but in the workplace? Why is it so difficult for people to just begin at the beginning and see where the process takes them? It creates dissonance. Okay, Katrina, absolutely so. Vincent, it may not be aligned with what we think. 100%, absolutely. It's how we learn. Okay, yeah. Emotions drive it. Greg, spot on. You guys are flawless in this. This is exactly what the problem is. In fact, if you wanted to narrow it down, in many cases, not all, but in many cases, you can sum it up in 3 letters. 3 letters tells you why we don't begin with real data and experience. Ego. And what is it about ego? There's a very, it creates dissonance. It may not be aligned with what we think. Yeah, so if we start from no ego, what might our data and experience, what might utilizing the ladder of inference tell us? What might we discover if we follow this process legitimately from the beginning to the end? Forget ego for a moment. Without it, what might we discover by following this process? The best way, absolutely, but what might the best way be? Not specifically, mind you, but the best way might be what? It might not be what we think it should be. It might be different. And we might have a picture of what the best way looks like, but we might be wrong. And when we start with real data and we process this in a legitimate, genuine, open way, we may very well discover that we're wrong. And that's part of the problem. People don't want their paradigms changed. Thank you, Ted. Absolutely, right? And this is just a reality. I like to think I know what I'm doing. I like to think I'm competent. Nobody wants to be wrong, but the reality is making mistakes is probably one of the most beneficial things human beings do. General Johnson of Johnson & Johnson said, if I wasn't making mistakes, I wasn't making progress, right? So what we have is a situation where if we follow this for real and don't shortcut the process and shortcut ourselves in the process, then we can create potentially better outcomes. And so we have to be aware of that. And so one of the things that I want us to look at is what is the way we learn about things? So I have here an image of memory. And in a sense, this is a little bit of a visualization about how memory works. We tend to, as human beings, think that memory is a camera or a video recorder of some sort, right? At best, it's more like an impressionist watercolor. But we collect these pieces of information, and then sometimes we learn new things. So here's my question. If this is the things that I know, and I learn something new as a result of my situation, I acquire new information. Here's our little red dot, and the little red dot is new information. And here's the cool thing. The red dot, this new information, is very much, maybe not 100%, but is mostly in a line with what I already know. It doesn't contradict anything. It's better, newer, fresher knowledge, new outlook, new possibility or something, but it's in accord with what I already know. What do you think I will do with that red dot as a result of learning something new? And so now I have my existing mental structure, and now I've learned something new. Here's my little dot. What do you think happens to that little red dot? Okay, what do we got? Not linked. It's not linked. Okay, it's not linked. But what are we? So it's new information, but it's close to what I already know. So what am I likely to do with it? And Vincent said it's not linked. But what we'll do, accept it exactly. We will link it. Not actually, what we'll do is we'll shelter it, right? We'll bring it in. That's a great way of putting it, by the way. Thank you, Trina. We will shelter it within our beliefs. We will connect it. We'll make it work. We'll bring it into our existing structure of memory, and it will become part of how we think about things. Now, here's the problem. Sometimes we learn things and they're not close to what we know, and they're new, and they contradict things that we have previously discovered. It's something that will cause us to have to change one of the blue circles and not believe the same thing anymore. And now, when this new information, when the red dot of new information is further removed from what we currently know, what will we do with that? Greg said, ignore it. Art said, reject it. You are absolutely correct. We will essentially, to the extent possible, we will pretend it's not there. And we will kind of hope that it goes away at some point. Yeah, Ivy says we will let it go. This is exactly what we will tend to do. Now, some people are better at this, better at not doing this than others are. But there is a definite human tendency. It's outside of my world, and I'd like it to stay there. It's much harder for me to rethink some of the things that I know in a way that allows this new realignment, and it's a lot of work mentally. It's also difficult for us to let go from an ego perspective, but when we learn new things, we have to be willing to ask the question, am I able to incorporate it into my understanding of how things work, right? And just to give you a real world example of what goes wrong, and remember I mentioned before, I said there's a problem, we're gonna do something, and then we're gonna check to see if it fixed it. We call that ready, fire, aim. And we think we understand the nature of a problem, but we don't. And then we get new information, but it doesn't match, so we don't pay any attention to it. So one of the things that this is called the Cobra effect. And one of the reasons it's called the Cobra effect is because in India, when Great Britain was over there as a colonizer, in the city of Delhi, they had a huge problem with cobras. They were everywhere. So without a clear understanding of what would happen, they came up with a solution and they put it into place. They offered a small fee for each dead cobra that the natives brought in. And this seemed to work like gangbusters. They were bringing in the skins of cobras left, right, and sideways, and the government was paying for them, and everything was going to get better. Except that after a short time of this, it appeared as if the number of cobras in the city hadn't changed at all. And so the government kind of scratched their heads and said, wait, we're paying people to bring them in. They're bringing them in, you know, in buckets. Why isn't the cobra population dropping? And what they discovered was that the amount of money they were paying the natives to kill the cobras was more than enough to cover the cost of raising them. So people became cobra farmers. And then they would take them and bring the skins to the government and get money for them. And this became a small, profitable side business for many people, except what it didn't do was reduce the cobra population. So the government decided, forget it, this doesn't work at all. We're not going to pay anybody for cobras anymore. And of course, all the people who were growing cobras, raising them in little cobra farms, had no longer any financial interest in raising cobras. So they let them go into the city. End result, that after the government had spent much time, much energy, and much money, there were more cobras in the city of Delhi than what they began with. And this, ever since, has been referred to as the Cobra effect. This is the problem with ready, fire, aim. We think we understand something, but we clearly do not. And that's what gets us into trouble. We end up with a result that is either no better or sometimes actually even worse than what we began with. All right, so one of the things that we can do to create a different outcome is recognize what gets in our way. And so I'd like you to take a look at these, and we'll go through them. And then here's what I want you to do. I don't want you to share this. I just want you to self-assess for a moment. What is it that you on this list may have been guilty of at some point when addressing problems? Are we thinking only about ourselves? Are we literally not thinking about ourselves and just want to jump and join in with what everybody else is thinking? Or other companies just like us have made these same decisions, but we don't stop to think critically if that's actually the position we're in. And if we don't clearly understand the problem, we might jump into it just because everybody's doing it, and it turns out it's not such a good idea. Social conditioning. Why do I think the way I think? Excuse me. One of the things that becomes important about being aware of ourselves is that human beings are kind of like a GPS, which requires two pieces of information. Where am I? Where do I want to go? In order for us to make progress as humans in any setting, but particularly in the workplace settings, we have to self-assess. We have to start thinking, where am I? What is it about my social conditioning that makes me think the things that I do? Am I ever being arrogant or intolerant about other people's experiences? Am I biased because of my own experiences? And am I just doing this because it's fast? Right? Think about, consider, I mean, we could get into this for a whole day. Consider how many states and federal offices and governments have made statements concerning COVID-19, the coronavirus, right? And then 2 days later made a completely different statement. Or 3 weeks later said, oh wait, those things were wrong. A perfect example is the estimate that came out with the Imperial College of London. The Imperial College of London, which no one got to see how they made these models, came up with the idea of 2 million deaths as a result of COVID-19 in the United States, which turns out to have been significantly out of proportion to what actually happened. And now, as they go back on it, this was several months ago, this was 2 months ago when they put this together, it turns out some of their assumptions were incorrect. It turns out some of their calculations were not so hot about it, right? Ivy had mentioned also getting excited. I think people got very excited about this, but we have seen so much contradictory information, not just from people who think differently in general, but from, like I said, from state governments, from between state and federal, between federal and federal sometimes, and certainly between state and state, because many of these elements cause people problems. Right? Either it's, oh, we must listen to these experts, or we have to do this, or we have to do that, or we just don't have time to make sure that everything's where it's supposed to be, and that we've done our homework properly, and that we clearly understood the situation before we came up with solutions to our problem. And so every one of these creates a situation where the outcome turns out not to be what we wanted it to be, because we haven't taken the time to clearly understand what the problem is in the first place. So how can we? Well, the good news is there are a couple of things that we can do. When we are looking at this, we can be aware of how the aspects of ourself are affecting this. What is creating my judgment? So these are questions that I encourage you to ask yourself. How do I feel about this? By the way, I want to be very clear about this one. Not what do I think about it? How do I feel about it? Those are two radically different perspectives. Where are my opinions coming from? What is it that I'm basing my information on, right? And then is it intuitive? And please never underestimate intuition, but it may not always be the best thing to use as an only guide, right? I'm only basing this on my intuition. I'm only basing this on an emotional construct. None of these turn out to be the best as single drivers, but all of them turn out to be useful in creating a broader, better, clearer picture of what we're dealing with. Okay, excuse me. So here's the first of the two things that I want to talk to you about. How many of you remember as a child when the teacher or your parent said, okay, we're going to put our thinking caps on now? Just curious, how many of you have heard that expression before? Put on your thinking cap. By the way, this is a relative age indicator of anybody who says yes. Absolutely. Greg, Ted, Mary, I'm sure there's in some fashion, many of us have heard it, even those of us who are relatively younger. And a man named Edward de Bono came up with what he called the 6 thinking hats. And the basis behind the thinking hats is that it's unlikely, oh, Ivy said still do, excellent, good for you. De Bono said that it's unlikely that we will on purpose do these things. I'm sorry, I said that sideways, that we will do these things unless we do them on purpose. It's unlikely that we will contemplate different perspectives. Excuse me, I may have eaten a frog this morning. It's unlikely that we will do these things accidentally. We can do them on purpose. And so he created what he called the 6 hats. And the 6 hats are really straightforward. And by the way, I hope everybody knows we're going to give you a handout for this and a separate handout, and you'll have all of this information on it as well. But it's good. So for instance, the white hat is, what is the data? What are the facts? What are things that are more concrete that we know? And the red hat was, when you're looking at it, what's your intuition? What's the emotional situation surrounding this problem? The black hat, and I'm going to particularly emphasize the black hat, is what are the negative aspects about any possible solution? One of the things that happens to human beings is that when somebody puts out and promotes a potentially good solution to a problem, we tend to connect to it emotionally, and we jump on it and we go, oh yes, and we all want to be part of the good working solution. So we emotionally connect to it. The problem is that we don't always stop to make sure that it's the best possible one, and we don't always stop to make sure what might go wrong. So the black hat is deliberately looking at something from the negative perspective. So we think this is a great idea. We think this is going to work perfectly. What can go wrong? The job of the person wearing the black hat is to say, well, what about this? Well, what if that happened? What if that happened? What if this doesn't work out? What if this goes sideways? What if somebody else has a different perspective? The black hat is critical at making your proposal tougher and more resilient. And then we have the yellow hat, which is, what are the potential positives, right? What are the individual aspects that we might not even be thinking about? How might other people be affected? Green is creativity. What would be the best possible way to solve this for the largest number of people, right? And then blue is, how are we thinking about what we're thinking? Blue is literally the thinking cap. So each of these has a purpose in terms of how we approach a topic. And de Bono said that if we look at it from these perspectives on purpose, intentionally, that we can create a greater likelihood of being open to the possibilities, of being willing to see things. He also created something that is similar to this, but it's a little bit more formal in terms of its process, and I want to share this with you guys now. It's called Tu Lo Po So Go. And it's very simple. The premise here is to work through a concrete process regardless of what is happening. And the first thing is to, and you've heard me say this a couple times, that we have to clearly understand the problem. And this is that element. Where do we want to go to? What is the goal? And is the goal clearly understood by everybody? How many of you have seen a situation where upper management solves a problem that exists somewhere further down the line and then implements the solution, but has never bothered to check with the people who will be implementing the solution to see A, if it deals with the problem clearly, B, actually corrects the problem, and C, is the best possible solution? we've left out all of the potential benefit that Brian. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to say that Brian is completely correct when he says it happens daily. Excuse me, this is exactly what happens on a regular basis, and it does so to our detriment. When we don't ask the people that are involved in the process if it's making it better to make these changes, we're losing something very dear in some cases. Lo is it's the same word you've heard before. Lo and behold, look, the old way to say look. Look at all of the circumstances surrounding what's going on. What do we know? How many times have you seen in business where some department or aspect of the business makes a very positive, beneficial change in their situation that turns out to have a negative impact with somebody else over here? Look means, how will this affect other people by doing what we're doing? Po is very simple as well. What is possible? What is the potential here? What can we make from this? What can be the benefits of this? And so is critical here as well. So what happens if we do this, right? It's looking ahead based on before you do it. So what happens if this works? And then a critical aspect of so what happens if we don't do this? In fact, the question to ask sometimes is actually, so what happens if we do nothing, right? All too often, we want to create solutions without realizing clearly what the answer is to the problem. And sometimes the problem is, don't do anything. So just have that awareness. So what happens if we do this? So what happens if we do that? So what happens if we don't do anything? And then go is take action, right? And the creation of the form here is we start with understanding the problem, move through what's possible, look at who's involved, look at what's involved, consider our options, and then execute, and then move forward with it. And ultimately, what we're talking about here is an opportunity to make use of these. So now I will give you guys, we have a few minutes here. I'll turn it over to you guys. Do you have any questions relative to what we've been talking about here? Let's see, somebody's got one. Oh. So any thoughts, comments, questions, and then we'll move on and we'll have a little bit of a wrap up. Multi-generational. Again, Art, thank you for raising that. I think we could do an entire day on generations. The reality is that because people base their thinking on their background, on their education, on their cultural awareness, on their cultural development, on their family size, right? You have people who grew up with usually 2, 3, 4, 5 brothers. Now they're in an office with people who have been only children and don't have the brother and sister sibling awareness. So everything as simple as what your family is from can be part of what gets into the generational thinking process and why people look at things differently. When you've grown up with siblings, it's different from when you've grown up without them. When you've grown up if you started school in 2000, it's different from if you started school in 1960, which is different from if you started school in 1980. So we have these generational awarenesses, and we have to be conscious of them. We have to deliberately be thinking of them. Anybody else? Thoughts, comments, questions, suggestions? Vincent, addressing, what about customers' input? And this becomes critical. So please know that when we talk about internally at a company, the goal is to take care of the customer. So making certain that we understand, and a couple of you mentioned this at the beginning, absolutely, that the customer's needs and the customer is critical to making sure that we get everybody involved in how we approach these problems. Brian, thank you so much. I know some of you have to go. Best ways to approach multi-generational, i.e. find common ground. Part of it is talk to each other. Part of it is learn about the different generations. Maybe do something, what I call social work time, which brings people all together into one room, right? Have a pizza lunch. We're still talking about work, but we're talking about it differently from question, answer, go away, because that's usually what we do during the day. Question, answer, go away. But a social work setting is actually different. Thank you, Mary Ewing. Thank you very much. Always a pleasure to be here with you guys. And Ted, you said, been taught even within your own company with customers. Absolutely, internal, external customers. And when we are deliberately, intentionally taking advantage of how we approach a problem, we are much more likely to include the customer. We are much more likely to include the frontline customer service person. We are much more likely to do the things that will get us to the place where we want to be and not execute ready, fire. Did I hit anything? No, let's just get it loaded and shoot again. And that's what gets us into trouble. When we don't have a clear process, when we don't have a clear understanding of how we're thinking about things and how we want to move forward with it. So thank you guys very much. A little bit of a wrap up here. Let's see, there we go. Be aware of your own thought processes. Be aware of what causes you to think that way. Be aware of there are organized ways to do it. The ladder of inference, the 6 hats. Am I intentionally thinking about what might go wrong? Am I intentionally thinking about making sure that everybody is included in this discussion of the problem? Am I intentionally open to these possibilities, right? If you've enjoyed today's seminar, we ask that you be open to sharing it on any of the Facebook, social media, Twitter, LinkedIn, any of these. We're pretty much available on all of them. So if you have any further questions, or if there's anybody that wants to be able to go further into this, then clearly Mindset Go is available to you. We've got coaching, we've got training, we've got speaking. It's all available at mindsetgo.com. And so I will wish you great success.